we have with us Dr. David Parker from Kennesaw State University. He's a history professor where he teaches, among other things, courses in history and American religion. Dr. Parker's work reflects a wide range of interests in Georgia, the South, and American cultural history. He's written subjects ranging from Bill Arp and Sam Jones to Georgia Day, about African-American headstones, Confederate textbooks, and the origins of the word y'all, which is my favorite word of all time, and the wonderful Wizard of Oz. He's also co-edited Breaking the Heartland, the Civil War in Georgia. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. David Parker to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, folks, for coming out today. It's good to see y'all. When Robin asked me if I'd like to participate in this series, she said she knew I wasn't really a specialist in the American Revolution, but she says you do stuff with historical memory. And I do. Historical memory is the way groups and societies remember things and think about the past. You got the past, and then you got the way people remember the past. I've come to believe that how people remember the past sometimes just about as important as what actually happened. Let me give you an example. Robin mentioned Georgia Day. A few years back, y'all might know Georgia Day. Today, it's something that the Georgia Historical Society, which is located right across the street from this beautiful picture here, that's Forsyth Park down in Savannah. The Georgia Historical Society, they have this, what do they call it? The Georgia History Festival, which is a wonderful program. And they incorporate Georgia Day. Georgia Day is the 12th of February, honoring the founding of Georgia back in 1733. And the Georgia Historical Society, they're the ones who do Georgia Day now. But back in the old days, Georgia Day was a time for special programs in the state's public schools. A few years ago, I got curious about Georgia Day, how it came about and when and so forth. My project was a study in historical memory, and it turned out to be a good introduction for our topic today, how Georgia remembered the Revolution. So let me start with Georgia Day, if you all don't mind. Here's what I found when I looked into it. In January 1901, the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, specifically the Joseph Habersham chapter here in Atlanta, set up a committee, quote, to introduce the celebration of February 12th all over the state, especially in the schools. They publicized their plan in the Atlanta Constitution. They got the state school superintendent to urge all the schools to participate. And with the help of other DAR chapters across the state, the first Georgia Day, February 12th, 1901, was a huge success. Stories in the newspaper show that. You know, I'm not a fan of everything about this modern age, I'll admit. But one thing I love is Georgia historical newspapers. Do y'all know that database? An online database of a lot of Georgia newspapers, including hundreds of small-town newspapers. It's a wonderful resource, especially for a project like that, because I could look up and search very easily all the different schools across Georgia and all the towns. And I can prove from those newspapers that Georgia Day was a hit from the beginning. In Americus, quoting here from the newspapers, in Americus, historical sketches of the life of Oglethorpe were read, and altogether the occasion was rendered both interesting and instructive. In Jackson, pupils, after careful research into the histories of Georgia, entered into a discussion of Oglethorpe's life, lauding his motive in settling the colony, and some relating pleasant little incidents in the life in the colony and in England. At assemblies in Albany schools, each grade will have some part in the program, and an hour will be devoted to the memory of Georgia's founder, James Oglethorpe. So Georgia Day from the start, 1901, was a hit. And it continued to grow, the number of schools involved, but also its coverage, which grew to include more of colonial Georgia, not just February 12th, but colonial Georgia down to the Revolution. Nancy Hart was a big topic. The DAR likes Nancy Hart. Then in 1910, a big change. The state school commissioner published a book of program ideas for the schools for Georgia Day. The book was written by Mildred Lewis Rutherford, historian general of the Georgia Division of the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Rutherford's proposed programs offered a different perspective on Georgia Day from the earlier versions that we saw that first decade. In addition to celebrating colonial Georgia and the American Revolution, Rutherford added material that honored the Old South and the Confederacy. No longer would the focus be just on Oglethorpe's philanthropy, the work of John Wesley, the life of the colonist, the bravery of Georgians in the American Revolution. Now students could honor aristocratic plantation owners, faithful black servants, Georgia's brave and noble men fighting for liberty from an oppressive American government, and the sacrifices of Confederate women. Georgia Day changed. Based on the newspapers, not all schools followed Millie Rutherford's guidebook, but some did. My favorite example, 1911 Georgia Day exercises at Lafayette High School. And I like it partly because my wife, Jessica, back there, is a graduate of Lafayette High School. She graduated, I think, after 1911, though, right? So you weren't there for this. Describing the event, the Walker County Messenger, the local newspaper, made no mention at all of anything to do with colonial Georgia. Quote, "The stage was handsomely dressed in red bunting and big Confederate flags," the newspaper reported, "and the young ladies wore white dresses with red sashes to match the Confederate colors." The program included two pieces that praised Confederate soldiers. One was a poem recited with feeling and pathos, according to the newspaper, called "A Georgia Volunteer." The other was a song, "The Gray Faded Jacket," in which a mother and father remember when their son, quote, joined the brave band who rose in defense of our dear southern land. Their son didn't make it home. All they had was his gray faded jacket. This was followed by a story told in the Negro dialect of Tom, enslaved, who followed his enslaver to the war. When Master John was shot, Tom saved him, carrying him to the safety and care of the Union lines. There they urged Tom to go with them to escape slavery, but he said no and returned home. That faithful slave image. Georgia Day started as a way to honor Oglethorpe and the colonists who established the colony, but it became for many white Georgians a way to celebrate the Confederacy. That's historic memory. Historic memory gives people an identity. In this case, we see that a lot of Georgians in the early 20th century still identified with the Confederacy. An identity, a legitimacy, a duty, maybe even a mission. It explains who we are. It justifies what we are. Maybe it excuses what we do. So today I want to talk to you all about historic memory, and especially this question: how have Georgians remembered the American Revolution? The first big anniversary of 1776 was the 50th, 1826. Savannah called it the Jubilee, presumably from Leviticus 25:10, "And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you." Some of y'all recognize part of that as what? Liberty Bell. That's the phrase on the Liberty Bell. The Jubilee in Savannah began at dawn with a display of the U.S. flag over the steeple of the Exchange building there on Bay Street. There were cannon salutes fired across the city as people gathered at Christ Church, where the Declaration of Independence was read, speeches given, organ music played. The day ended with a dinner in the handsomely decorated upper room of the Exchange. According to the newspaper, the dinner was not concluded until a very late hour, during which 13 toasts were drank. Cheers. 13 toasts were drank, accompanied by music and a great number of patriotic and sentimental songs. A bit of a counterpoint, perhaps, was in an editorial comment in the Savannah Republican. The newspaper said that we will continue to celebrate, quote, so long as the nation preserves its liberty and venerates the Declaration which pronounced these states free, sovereign, and independent. The Missouri Compromise, what Thomas Jefferson called a fire bell in the night, was just a few years earlier. Maybe this comment, states' rights, reflects lingering concerns over that. It certainly provides a foretaste of what's to come. Before we get too far along, I got to mention Nancy Hart. I've got to mention Nancy Hart, one of the most famous stories in the Revolutionary War. Y'all know that. Y'all know that story. British soldiers forced themselves into her cabin, start harassing her, force her to cook a turkey that they had shot. They start drinking, and as they got drunk, she starts sliding their muskets outside through a chink in the cabin wall. They notice what she's doing. They spring to their feet. Nancy threatens to shoot the first man who moves. A soldier lunges at her. She shoots, kills him. They ended up hanging the others. Now there's a story. Now there's a story. We know Nancy Hart existed as a real person, but as far as we can tell, the Nancy Hart story didn't exist until the 1820s, when it made a brief appearance in a Milledgeville newspaper. Some people have suggested that perhaps the story is not true. Maybe it was invented years later, after the fact, to create a southern version of Molly Pitcher. You all know Molly Pitcher, a northern heroine of the American Revolution. Well, there's a story about President Warren G. Harding in the early 1920s. He heard that Paul Revere never completed that ride made famous in Longfellow's poem. He was discovered and captured by the British. But Harding said, President Harding said, I love the story of Paul Revere, whether he rode or not. Well, I love the story of Nancy Hart, whether she shot those soldiers or not. The story perhaps originated in 1825, but it wasn't well known until 1848, when Elizabeth Elliot from New York, a leader in the American women's rights movement of the time, included it, the Nancy Hart story, in a book, The Women of the American Revolution. Elizabeth Elliot was trying to open new places for women in American society, trying to prove the truth of the Declaration of Independence, that all people are created equal. Nancy Hart was a great example for that. Elliot's book was popular, and suddenly, 1848, Nancy Hart was famous, really famous. A dozen years later, Nancy Hart was a symbol for something else. During the Civil War, about 40 women in LaGrange worried that with the men all off fighting, the town was left unprotected. They armed themselves. They formed a militia company that they named in honor of Nancy Hart. They were the Nancy Harts. They were serious about this. They drilled, they had target practice and so forth. And when Wilson's raid approached the town in April 1865, just as the war was coming to a close, the Nancy Harts met them on the edge of town, peacefully surrendered LaGrange to the Union soldiers, and in return, the Union commander protected private property in LaGrange. So Nancy Hart, whether she shot those soldiers or not, has been remembered in service of the women's movement, and as a role model for rebelling against a tyrannical government. That second one is a little ironic, perhaps, given which tyrannical government she was protesting now. But it prepares us for the next point about how Georgians remembered the Revolution. My mouth is very dry, excuse me. In the Civil War, both sides, North and South, Union and Confederate, both sides claimed to be following in the steps of the founding fathers. Everyone knows Lincoln's opening lines at Gettysburg in 1863, fourscore and 7 years ago. That would have been 1776. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln saw the United States in the Civil War as fighting to prove that those words, promises of the Declaration, still meant something. But for Jefferson Davis, it was the Confederacy, not the Union, that was the progeny of the Revolution. President Jefferson Davis urged Confederates to, quote, renew such sacrifices as our fathers made to the holy cause of constitutional liberty. Drew Gilpin Faust, in her study of Confederate nationalism, said that for Georgians and others, secession represented continuity, not discontinuity. The Confederacy was the consummation, not the dissolution of the American dream. And Sarah Rubin made the same argument. Rather than representing a challenge to the ideals of the founding fathers, the Confederacy would be the perfection of the founders' vision. And that's the way they saw it. The difference boiled down to this. What was the Revolutionary War about? For Jefferson Davis, it was simply the right to rebel, a justification for revolution. For Abraham Lincoln, it was, as he said in Gettysburg, the proposition that all men are created equal. This is what historian James McPherson found in What They Fought For, a book that analyzed the letters and diaries of hundreds of Civil War soldiers. He found that soldiers on both sides saw themselves as fighting for the legacy of 1776. For Union soldiers, the war was to protect democracy and to end the evil of slavery, the antithesis of the ideas of Declaration of Independence. For Confederates, the war was a fight for states' rights and liberty from the tyranny of the North. McPherson offers several examples of Georgia soldiers who remembered the Revolution exactly that way. In 1864, a Georgia dirt farmer channeled Patrick Henry when he wrote to his wife from the trenches at Petersburg, "If I fall, let me fall, for I will fall in a good cause. If I cannot get liberty, I prefer death." During the retreat from Gettysburg, a captain in the 50th Georgia Infantry Regiment heard of the Confederate surrender at Vicksburg, 4th of July, 1863. "What a calamity," he wrote to his wife. "But let us not despair. Our forefathers were whipped, Confederate, right? Our forefathers were whipped in nearly every battle, and yet after 7 years of trials and hardships, they achieved their independence." The 4th of July. Many white Georgians, many white Southerners in general, thought of the 4th of July as their holiday. After all, weren't they the same context, trying to overthrow tyranny? Not only did Georgians claim the 4th of July, they said Yankees had no right to it. On the 4th of July, 1863, outside of Savannah, Josephine Habersham, who happens to be the grandniece to Joseph Habersham, who lent his name to the Atlanta chapter of the DAR that started Georgia Day, Josephine Habersham expressed dismay in her diary that, quote, "the insolent Yankees," here she means the Unionists, "the insolent Unionists in our neighborhood are firing their guns in honor of the day. Little do they know or appreciate the precious blessing of liberty left to us by our fathers on that glorious day. 1776. A few days later, she reported in her diary that she had heard news of the fall of Vicksburg on the 4th. Took news a few days to travel to get to Savannah. Many white Southerners quit celebrating the 4th after that. The Macon Weekly Telegraph argued that the South made that holiday, and around it cluster some of the proudest reminiscences of her, the South's history. In one word, we believe the 4th of July belongs to the South, and she should keep it as a national holiday. But most white Georgians gave up on it for years until Reconstruction ended, and some a bit longer than that. After the war, as whites gave up on the 4th of July, black Southerners and black Georgians began to celebrate the day. Remember Frederick Douglass? What to a slave is the 4th of July? Speech he delivered in Rochester, 1852. What to the American slave is your 4th of July, he asked. I answered, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. That was 1852. What to a slave is the 4th of July? The answer to that question changed a little bit in 1865. In Augusta, 4th of July that year, 1865, 4,000 African Americans made a procession viewed by several thousand others, parading under 3 banners: Abraham Lincoln, the father of our liberties and savior of his country; slavery and disunion, dead; and freedom and equality is our motto. James Lynch, a prominent AME minister and black leader, gave the speech for the occasion. His talk was titled, "The United States, Her Glory and Mission, Declaration of Independence Ushers in a New Epoch." Similar events in Georgia and elsewhere in the South. 4th of July, 1867, a large assemblage of African Americans met at City Hall in Atlanta in a celebration of their new liberty. The day's celebration included a reading of the Declaration of Independence. African Americans in Atlanta and Augusta and elsewhere in Georgia, they knew how to remember the Revolution. They knew how to remember the Revolution. So 2 perspectives on the Declaration of Independence. On the one hand, there's the self-evident truth of human equality and inalienable rights. On the other hand, the opposite hand, is the right to rebel against oppression, the right of insurrection against a government if that government tries to enforce human equality and inalienable rights. Jumping up to 1876, the centennial. 1776, 1876, the centennial. The city of Savannah was enthusiastic in its celebration of the centennial, 4th of July, 1876. The German Society celebrated with music and dancing, target shooting, a speech, the planting of a liberty tree. The Savannah Yacht Club sponsored a centennial regatta with a $50 prize for the fastest yacht. And of course, there was a parade sponsored by the Hibernian Society and ending with the reading of the Declaration of Independence and a cannon salute. 1876. Not all Georgians were as celebratory as those in Savannah. The editor of the Calhoun Times looked back at the previous century. Georgians celebrated the 4th of July, he said, so long as those principles instituted by the framers of our Constitution were respected and adhered to. But when sectional hate began to show itself in our national government, and then he gives several examples of sectional hate, including the emancipation of slavery and Reconstruction in the South. When sectional hate began to show itself in our national government, the South, the day began to lose significance among the original lovers of liberty here in the South. PHB, all we have is the initials. PHB put all of this into verse for the Cherokee Georgian, a newspaper published in Canton. It's not great poetry, but it's interesting. This is freedom's jubilee, the natal day of liberty, the grand centennial, glorious fourth, o'er east and west and south and north. 100 years ago today, our country 'neath oppression lay. And then there met a faithful band who pledged their all to free the land. And then they go through many verses of American history, yada, 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 getting to the end of the Civil War. The end of the Civil War, a couple of verses here. At length, the stronger won the day. Thus ceased the dreadful bloody fray. But vengeance, still unsatisfied, yet raged upon the victor's side. Wronged, insulted, and oppressed, the vanquished have had little rest. The chains from which the slaves were freed are placed upon our limbs instead. Whoever PHB was, he or she certainly didn't care much for the state of things at the centennial. The 1876 Centennial Exposition ran in Philadelphia from May to November 1876. It was the first World's Fair to be held in the United States, and since it coincided with the centennial anniversary, it had as one of its goals reunion, to help bring the North and South together a decade after the war ended, as Reconstruction was coming to a close. Celebration of America's greatness. It was heavily advertised, including in the South, in newspapers, ad after ad for transportation to the exposition, lodging at the exposition, guidebooks to the exposition, and more. Some Georgians loved it. The Atlanta Constitution said that the Centennial Exposition was an opportunity that no one, quoting here, no one who can command the necessary time and money should neglect. 2 weeks are needed, although one busy week is better than none at all. Henry Grady joined the staff of the Atlanta Constitution in 1876. Grady, a leader of the New South movement, pushing for sectional reconciliation, economic progress, and so forth. Grady loved the Centennial Exposition, you can imagine. It inspired him to support similar expositions in the South. But a lot of Southerners, a lot of Georgians weren't so sure. Reconstruction had ended in Georgia by 1876, but it continued with federal troops in South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana. So a lot of Georgians didn't trust the northern sponsors of the exposition. They were afraid that they would not be represented. They didn't want to see any displays concerning the Union victory. They were touchy about seeing any references to emancipation. One Southern man was said to have been so offended seeing a painting of Abraham Lincoln using a sledgehammer to break the chains holding an enslaved black man. He was so offended that he left the exposition and went home. Anyway, our time's getting short, ladies and gentlemen, so let me skip a century real quickly. From 1876, the centennial, to 1976 and the bicentennial. As I look around, I'm not sure any folks here are old enough to remember 1976. I am, maybe some of y'all. You remember your younger days, maybe some of y'all. The bicentennial was huge, remember? The American Freedom Train, you remember the bicentennial minutes on TV? Bicentennial postage stamps, bicentennial coins. Do you remember the crass commercialization of the bicentennial? Planning for the bicentennial began on the 4th of July, 1966, 10 years ahead. Initially, the celebration was planned as a single city exposition, kind of like Philadelphia in 1876. This committee decided Philadelphia or maybe Boston. But after 6.5 years of arguing over how this would go and largely spinning their wheels, Congress decided that there would not be just one huge event. Instead, in December of 1873, they created something called the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration, ARBA. and charged it with encouraging and coordinating and supporting locally sponsored events. Thousands of counties, towns, and cities across the United States responded. As a result, the bicentennial was truly a people's celebration, much more from the bottom up than from the top down. And so the bicentennial ended up being a lot. It included, let me start over there. The bicentennial ended up being a lot more than just dead white men, as they say about these things. In Peachtree City, the McIntosh Trail, an outdoor drama, told the story of the Creek Nation and its chief, William McIntosh. In Keysville, Burke County, Boggs Academy, a black prep school, we used to call them, produced Echoes of a Dream, a 45-minute dramatic experience of black pride in song, poetry, and dance that told what black people celebrated the bicentennial and why. In Marietta, a series of events, speakers, and so forth with local educators relating the black experience to the bicentennial. The High Museum of Art, Remember the Ladies, an exhibit on women in America during the Revolutionary period. In Cairo, Georgia, publication of a Black Heritage cookbook. In Atlanta, recordings featuring the music of black symphonic composers. At Fort Valley, a week's worth of programs on the black experience in America, especially education, and on Creek Indians' relation to the bicentennial. At Lafayette redeems itself. Fortune Grammar School offered community-wide drama portraying community heritage, including black and Indian history. The bicentennial, ladies and gentlemen, changed the way Americans would do these commemorations. No more uncritical celebration of America's glory and honor. Now, let me give you an example of what happened, partly anyway as a result of the bicentennial experience. The Civil War Centennial, 1961 to 1965, this was before the bicentennial. Historian Robert Cook wrote a book about the Civil War Centennial celebration. He called it Troubled Commemoration. And he talked about how part of the context of the centennial was the Cold War, the Red Scare. Y'all remember the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that. National leaders wanted to show a united front against the threat of communism. And so the Civil War Centennial would emphasize that, American unity. Kind of like Ken Burns' Civil War miniseries. Remember that? Remember Shelby Foote? Both sides honorable and valiant. A difference of opinion over matters of national governments. That's all it was. And this, of course, allowed community leaders in Georgia, elsewhere in the South, to go all lost cause. Remember how it ended? For Ken Burns, the war ended with the reunion at Gettysburg 50 years after. There's beautiful photographs of this. Many of you have seen them. Gray-bearded Union and Confederate veterans gathering at the battlefield. They shake hands across the fence. They tell stories. They reminisce. Isn't that beautiful? And that's how the story ended for Ken Burns and for the Civil War Centennial. Well, that's one way to end the story, I guess. Or you could talk about the aftermath of the war, the rise of Jim Crow, political disfranchisement for black Georgians, racial violence, the lost cause, and so forth. The Civil War Centennial left out a lot of history, and it left out a lot of people. Thank you, sir. Very kind. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to take advantage of it immediately. The Civil War centennial left out a lot of history and it left out a lot of people. Fast forward 50 years from the Civil War centennial to the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, 2011 to 2015, after the bicentennial. The National Park Service's strategic plan, quote, the National Park Service will address the institution of slavery as the principal cause of the Civil War, and it will address the transition from slavery to freedom after the war for the 4 million previously enslaved African Americans. Incidentally, it was Stanley Bond, who at the time was superintendent of the Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park, who came up with the phrase, Civil War to Civil Rights. I remember hearing someone say, this is not your father's Civil War. Maybe we could let that be our guide as we think about how we might remember the Revolution now, 250 years down the road. Remember the words of the Declaration, equality, inalienable rights. Remember that we frequently failed as a nation and as a state to live up to those truths. Instead of whitewashing the past, acknowledge it. And finally, remember that we're not finished. America's not done yet. Georgia's not done. We're still a work in progress. And that sounds like a good ending place to me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for letting me share some of your time today. I appreciate it.